In the summer of 1914, Europe was at the absolute height of its imperial wealth and power. Yet a map of the continent revealed a paranoid landscape, strictly divided into two heavily armed rival camps, the Triple Entente to the west and east, and the Triple Alliance trapped in the middle. On June 28th, a 19-year-old nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, in the streets of Sarajevo. Austria-Hungary immediately blamed its rival, Serbia, and declared war. Because of the rigid web of treaties, this localized Balkan dispute triggered a massive chain reaction. Russia ordered its army to mobilize to defend its Slavic ally, which prompted Germany to declare war on Russia in response. Mobilization was no longer a diplomatic threat, it was a logistical machine. In 1914, these plans relied on thousands of precisely scheduled trains that, once set in motion, could not be diverted or stopped without throwing the entire army into chaos. By signing those orders, the leaders of Europe effectively handed their agency over to the clock. To survive a war on two fronts, Germany relied on the Schlieffen plan. The strategy was to advance rapidly through neutral Belgium, sweep down to encircle the French armies near Paris, and secure a quick victory before the massive Russian army mobilized. France had its own aggressive strategy, Plan 17. Instead of preparing a deep defense, French forces planned to charge directly into German territory to reclaim lost lands. Every empire marched out in August utterly confident. They trusted these pre-planned military maneuvers to deliver a swift, decisive victory. The troops genuinely expected to be home by Christmas. That strict German table derailed almost immediately. Unexpected, fierce resistance from Belgian fortresses bought crucial days for a British expeditionary force to land on the continent and engage the advancing German army. Further south, the aggressive French advance broke against German lines during the Battle of the Frontiers. Driven back with enormous losses, the French and British troops were forced to mount a desperate counterattack at the River Marne, just 40 miles outside Paris, barely halting the German advance. Over on the Eastern Front, a different miscalculation played out. The Russian army mobilized far faster than Berlin anticipated, pushing aggressively into East Prussia. But the Russians contributed to their own defeat by broadcasting their military maneuvers in uncoded radio messages. German generals intercepted the plans and masterminded a devastating encirclement at Tannenberg, taking 90,000 prisoners and destroying an entire Russian army. On every front, rigid 19th century tactics collided head-on with 20th century firepower. The result was widespread slaughter, erasing the belief that this conflict would be clean or brief. Britain commanded the most powerful navy in the world, boasting 29 modern battleships to Germany's 19. They immediately imposed a suffocating naval blockade designed to starve the German economy into submission. But just a week later, the British cruiser HMS Pathfinder was blown apart by a lethal new weapon. It became the first ship in history sunk by a submarine-launched torpedo. For over a century, the Royal Navy had ruled through the sheer weight on its surface fleet. Now, the most expensive battleships in history were suddenly vulnerable to a weapon that cost a fraction of their price and struck without warning from beneath the waves. As the stalemate deepened in Europe, the warring powers desperately looked for an advantage by pulling their vast colonial empires into the fight. The fighting spread across the globe. British forces suffered chaotic defeats in modern-day Kenya. Japanese troops seized German naval bases in China, and a deadly naval clash erupted off the coast of Chile. Back in Europe, the reality of industrialized combat was forcing a brutal adaptation. Soldiers advancing upright were cut down by rapid-fire machine guns, while the earth itself was torn apart by continuous, devastating artillery barrages. Hoping to outflank these deadly defensive positions, the two armies engaged in the race to the sea, moving ever further north. To survive the withering crossfire, millions of men had no choice but to dig deep into the earth. What started as temporary cover became a continuous 350-mile scar of fortified mud stretching entirely across the continent. The war of rapid movement was dead. By the winter of 1914, the bright, confident optimism of the summer marches was buried in freezing, static mud. This chart shows the staggering volume of human loss in just half a year. The Marne alone cost 250,000 casualties. Austro-Hungarians lost 300,000 men in retreat, and 60,000 Turkish troops fell in the frozen Caucasus. The empires had built an industrialized killing machine that neither side knew how to shut off. Grand strategies had devolved into a grim mathematics, trying to simply outbleed the enemy. Then, in a few sectors on the Western Front, that first Christmas saw a spontaneous pause. Men climbed out of their defensive lines and met their enemies in no man's land to share rations and play football. But when the carols ended and the men returned to their trenches, they weren't just returning to the mud. They were returning to a conflict that had outgrown the men who started it. The quick victory was gone, and the era of the grinding